And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus said to his disciples, I have come to set the earth on fire, and oh, how I wish it were already blazing. There is a baptism with which I must be baptized, and how great is my anguish until it is accomplished. Do you think that I have come to establish peace on the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, a household of 5 will be divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. A father will be divided against his son and his son against his father, a mother against her daughter, and a daughter against her mother, a mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
You all probably recognize the priest who is with us this morning, but maybe you don't actually know who he is. Father Theodore has covered Mass here a number of times, but I've been told that he never actually introduces himself to the parish. Right? So this is Father Theodore Haggerty. Right? He is a Benedictine monk at a monastery in Illinois, Aurora, Illinois. His monastery runs a Catholic high school, so he is a professor of theology at the high school. He's also the vocation director of their abbey. And it's always a privilege to have another priest with us here at St. Bernard, as well as when we have seminarians come and visit, right? It's always great for all of us to see that God is still giving vocations to the church. Many people think we are living in a crisis of vocations. That is untrue. We are living in a crisis of answered vocations. So many parishes experience no men going to the seminary for years and decades. It's not because God is not calling people to the priesthood. It is because our young people are not taught to understand the vocation and how to discern. So it's always a wonderful opportunity when we have priests and seminarians with us to remind all of our young men. There's a number of young men here in this parish who have a vocation to the priesthood. Right? It is not out of your reach. God calls many to the priesthood, but few respond. Few answer. Okay, Walker Grody? I'm just kidding. All right. I'm just kidding. Anyway, Father Theodore is here this weekend. He's just here on vacation because who doesn't want a vacation in Crawfordsville, Indiana, right? Vacation destination. Today I want to talk about this first reading from the prophet Jeremiah. Right? It's a very interesting reading, the prophet Jeremiah. So if you're not familiar with the life and context of Jeremiah, basically he was living in a very dark time of Israel's history. He was living in the 500s BC. And in his vocation as a prophet was basically to the cross. In fact, God commanded him never to marry because his vocation of being a prophet was going to be so dangerous and he was going to experience so much persecution that God did not want him to be hindered in any way by ties to a wife and children who would be at stake, right, as consequence of his ministry. Jeremiah was living during the age where the Babylonians were coming into Israel and they took over everything. Right? They carried the people out of the city and took them into exile. They burned the temple to the ground, right? The place that Solomon had built. They lost everything. Now, before this was happening, Jeremiah, one of the aspects of his vocation was that he was to warn the people that this was going to happen no matter what they tried. Because of their infidelity to God and to his covenant, they were having to endure the consequences of losing God's protection, right, and losing everything. And so as the people were defending the city against the Babylonians, Jeremiah urged them to stop fighting. It was only going to make things worse. And the people refused to listen. Right, as we heard in our first reading today, the princes went to the king and they said, this man, Jeremiah, he does not desire our well-being, but rather our ruin. It's a very striking line from that first reading. Jeremiah, out of a desire to help God's people, right, to help the people of Israel living in Jerusalem, was urging them to surrender. And they did not interpret it as advice of goodwill, but rather of maliciousness. It's very interesting. Is that not the same experience that many of us will have in our modern age if we are faithful to the truth of the Bible and the truth of the church? Many people no longer see the church as a force for the good in the world, but rather a voice of harm. One of the most characteristic aspects of our modern age is that in our modern age, we have been liberated from those ancient moral practices that held us back for years and years. And as a civilization, we have freed ourselves from the tyranny of the church. And nowhere have we seen this more so than in church teachings on morality, right? Beginning with Sigmund Freud himself in the 1800s, right? Famously diagnosing the greatest problem with our world is that people have repressed their sexual desires for centuries, and it has led to all sorts of unhappiness and malcontent. This is what Sigmund Freud taught. And in our modern age, even though people might not call themselves Freudian, many of us have bought that same lie. Many people in our modern age have been convinced that what humanity desires most of all is lust and the fulfillment of our lustful desires rather than love, true love, total, faithful, committed love. Many people wonder, why is the church so emphatic about her teachings about sexual morality? It's because the church actually values our sexuality. The church sees love and romance and marriage as one of the greatest gifts that God gives to us. All throughout the scriptures literally begin with a marriage and end with a marriage. The book of Genesis and the book of Revelation. But the church is adamant that in order for us truly to embrace that gift that God has given to us, we must do just that. We must embrace it as a gift and use it the way God intended. Whereas our culture tells us that if we truly want to be happy, right, we need to learn how to manipulate those rules. We need to take control of our sexuality or take control of our bodies even, right? And our modern transgender ideologies. The church is holding up not just ancient traditional moral customs, but the literal truth of the vocation of man and what truly leads to his happiness. The world says settle for all these shallow forms of love, and the church calls us to something higher, something total, faithful, committed. And if we all think about it hard enough, we recognize that the church is correct. People don't want shallow forms of love. And that is exactly what lust is. That is exactly what all of the contradictions in moral teachings are today. It is merely a glorification of lust, which is merely a perversion of true love. The church holds this up for us. And yet in our modern age, is there anything the church is hated more for than for her teachings on sexuality? In the words of G.K. Chesterton, in every age, the church is the antidote to society's wills. And for that very reason, in every age, it is often mistaken as the poison in civilization. We all think about this deep enough. We know that this is true. Nobody can honestly think that the modern hookup culture is truly leading to greater happiness in our civilization. The increase of infidelity in marriage, the increase of divorce, the increase of children who grew up without one or both of their parents, right, because they were born out of wedlock. Do we really think this is better for our civilization? Of course not. And yet the church calls us to this higher calling. And just like Jeremiah, the church is seen as an enemy of humanity, prohibiting true human flourishing. It might sound comical, but I actually think he was prophetic. Christopher Hitchens, the famous atheist who often got in debates with Christians, one of the things he said about Christianity was not so much that it was incorrect, but that it was evil. He said that to raise your faith, to raise your children in a Christian church which teaches you all these backward moral traditions is equivalent to child abuse. And that might seem crazy, but I think more and more in our culture we're seeing this. Look at what happened at the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Look at the violence that followed, the hatred, merely out of the church's desire to hold up these traditional values. I think all of us recognize this if we think about it hard enough, that the church in her teachings, they might seem burdensome, they might seem cumbersome, but we all recognize that the church is not just saying a no to happiness. The church is not saying a no to sexual satisfaction. The church is saying yes to true love, right, and true fulfillment. I think many of us recognize that if we really think about it hard enough. But one thing I want to talk about this morning is something that's even a little more deeper, and perhaps something that is even more personal, and something that if I was a gambling person, I would imagine you've probably never heard anybody actually talk about. It's the reality that nobody wants to point out, and yet all of us are experiencing, and in many ways contributing to. I'm going to talk about something this morning that, again, is a very personal issue. And before I talk about it, I want everybody to recognize that when I talk about this topic, I'm not being judgmental of anybody, right? All of us make mistakes, and then the reality is, all of us in some ways have contributed these false ideologies in our culture, whether it be have been proactive in practicing those ideologies or merely stood by as those ideologies take hold in our culture. What I want to talk about this morning is the sad reality that all of these modern ideologies of sexual liberation and sexual revolution, the greatest victim who it has affected is actually women. It's actually women. So many of these sexual revolution ideologies, right, they were said that they were going to liberate women, right? Many of them have been advocated by modern feminists, right, pushing all these different movements, saying that it would liberate women from their attachments to unwanted pregnancies and unwanted marriages and families, and they would finally be liberated. The reality is that the exact opposite has happened. And again, I don't point this out to say that anybody's stupid or ignorant. I just think it's the sad reality that many of us, we really aren't aware of, especially men. Right? Think about in the ways in our modern culture. Think about who is affected the most by the sexual revolution. For example, who is affected the most by the widespread use of videos on the internet, of adult content? How is making men addicted to that content make them in any way prepared to be a good husband or a good father to their future spouse? And now women have to deal with the consequences of marrying men who are victims of being enslaved, those things on the internet. Who is the greatest victim of things like abortion and birth control? What does that mean? The advocates of the feminist culture want to say that, well, this is great because this means that women aren't going to experience unwanted pregnancies. Okay, but what's the flip side of that? The flip side of that is that it means that it is so much easier for men to be promiscuous and use women without the consequences of any sort of commitment, whether they're married or not. Why is there so much infidelity in marriages today? Because it's so much easier to be unfaithful than it was in the past. Or think about abortions. Right? Men don't have to go through that trauma of having a child ripped from their womb, like what happens with women. I remember talking to a woman in my parish a couple of years ago, and she told me that she still has nightmares about the child she aborted when she was young. She has nightmares about this child judging her on Judgment Day and condemning her to hell. Men don't have to experience that trauma that comes with abortion. Men don't experience the trauma that comes from being used, right, in a romantic way. And believe me, I know this as a priest. I hear confessions of young people. When men are promiscuous at a young age, the reality is, unfortunately, it doesn't affect them nearly as much as it affects the women they partake in it with. The results of young women being promiscuous before marriage. It often leaves them in bouts of depression, desiring to kill themselves even. They are the victims of this promiscuous culture. You know, something that is maybe even more neglected than anything else, even modern birth control. Many people are totally unaware of the damaging effects this has had on women, and particularly women who are of a minority culture. Many people don't realize that Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, she was extremely racist. She went to many different Ku Klux Klan rallies. And the reason why she wanted abortion and birth control was to make black people and other minorities stop having so many children. She says it right there in her writings. Many people don't realize that. Have you ever wondered why Planned Parenthood is often in minority neighborhoods? It's because it's her vision still being played out. Or many people don't realize that when birth control was developed, the immense damaging effects it had on women. When they first started to do the testing and studies about birth control, they actually had birth control for men too. But guess what? There were some undesired side effects for men, and so they stopped producing birth control for men. And even though there were side effects for women, these studies kept on going. Many women died in those studies. That's why when Margaret Sanger was beginning these studies, they started experimenting on women in Central and Latin America because they knew that they didn't have the power to fight back legally. And if you think that was just in the beginning and no longer happens, think again. Even in the 2000s, right, Pfizer, who developed the birth control shot, they were sued for over $700 million because of the effects of their shot thinning out the bones of women. Or Johnson & Johnson, right? Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, we both heard about them with these vaccines. Johnson & Johnson, when it developed the birth control patch, in the first year was sued by thousands of women, again, for the damaging effects the patch was having. And if you think about it in a realistic way, you understand that this shouldn't be surprising. Why would it surprise us that when you give somebody a medication that convinces their body that it's pregnant for months and even years on end, you really don't think that that's going to have some sort of long-term consequence medically? Of course it is. The sad reality that the product of the sexual revolution, in ways that most of us are completely unaware of, it claimed to be a liberation for women. But if you ask me, I think it is one of the most sexist movements that has ever taken place in our culture. And women are the primary victims. It is important that we talk about this, especially here in the church. And I know some of you might think that maybe I'm sounding a little bit extreme, but you can go research yourself. The information is all out there. But I'm a firm believer that in the church, we need to talk about these issues because nobody else is talking about it. And the people who are talking about it are completely ignoring these sad truths, these sad realities. Just like in the days of Jeremiah, people interpret the church's teachings, the church's advice to our civilization as harmful, as backward, as outdated. But more and more, I am convinced that the church continues to be the true antidote to our society's wills, especially when it comes to these issues of the sexual revolution. We need the wisdom and the teachings of the church to help guide our society back to fulfillment and happiness. Why else could we think that living in the United States, we are among the healthiest and wealthiest, most powerful people in the world, and yet a third of Americans claim to be unhappy? It's because we completely ignored the advice of the church, the advice of tradition, these moral truths that every society is held to be true, except for our modern, arrogant culture, which thinks that we are so much more intelligent and more advanced, so much more liberated than those who have gone before us. Just like in the days of Jeremiah, people are seeing the church today. And we need to be more confident and loyal and faithful the church, recognizing that it truly is. It is not the poison, but rather the church is the antidote.